Morning, everyone. Shavua Tov. We are up to Parakeh Mishna Tes. Okay, Sa'ah Truma Shnafel Umeya. We have the volume of a Sa'ah of Truma that fell into 100 times Chulin, which already, as we mentioned before, potentially has the ability to nullify. Okay, we're back. It seems that when grain, I'm going to read to you from the Yad Avram here. When grain is milled and made into flour, the volume of the flour may be greater or lesser than the volume of the original grain. This depends on the grade of the grain. A higher grade of grain will yield a greater volume of flour. A lower grade of grain will yield a lesser volume of flour. That is the premise that this Mishnah is working on. And at the bottom, they bring down an explanation. Melech Hashem explains that lower grade grain is often infested with worms who devour the inside of the kernels, thus reducing the yield of flour. Got to make sure you get. I believe you have to make sure you get to deal with those worms. But that's how the Melech Hashem is explaining. The lower grade is infested; it kind of eats out the inside of the kernels, and you have less to yield of flour. And you're going to sift out those worms somehow. But at the end of the day, this is the premise Mishnah is working on. That when you grind flour, it could either yield a greater volume than the original volume of the grain, or possibly less. Now, in our case, the case is after you ground it, it came out being less. You don't have the same volume as you had before. So now the question arises in the following. The question is, and I'll read to you again from the Yad Avram, did the 100-to-1 proportion of chulin to truma remain unchanged? Or should we suspect that the truma grain is of a higher grade than the chulin grain? In that case, the truma may have yielded more flour than the chulin, and the proportion of chulin flour to truma flour will no longer suffice to nullify the truma. Meaning, do we have to be concerned? We're not talking about that, we know. Do we have to be concerned that perhaps the truma was of a higher grade, and therefore it produces more? It's going to produce more flour than the chulin that's of a lesser grade. And if that would be happening, there's going to be a difference in what each one produces. You could possibly lose your 100-to-1 ratio. So what do we say? Do we say in this kind of a case, when we don't know otherwise, that everything is uniform, everything changes in a uniform manner, or do we have to consider that maybe it wasn't uniform, and that you've got more of the truma flour now than meaning in the amount that now is produced after you grind it up, you've got more truma flour than the chulin flour, and your ratio of 100-to-1 isn't there anymore. So the Mishnah says, Kashem shapachasu achulin, just as the non-truma grain became less, kach pachasaha truma, the truma became less in the same manner, umutter, and it's permissible. Meaning we don't consider that the ratio changed. If we see if they seem to be the same grain, same grade grain, then we say it was a uniform decrease, and therefore your original ratio is still there. Now, now the case is a little different. You've got a sa'av truma, and it fell into less than 100, so it wasn't nullified. Utachanan. Now you went in and you ground it up. Well, yisiru. Now you have more than before. Kashem shoyisiru hachulin. So we say, this as the chulin increased in volume, kachesirat truma. The truma also increased, and it remains permitted. Just like we were saying before. They both are going, anything that changes is going to be uniform. Both are going to be the same. So if I had less than 100-to-1 ratio before, I assume that ratio remained. Now, but if it's known that the chulin wheat is a higher grade than the truma, and therefore you know that it's going to produce more than the truma, mutter, then it's permissible. That means is that if you are able to know that one grade is better than the other, and you can assume that it's going to produce, or actually more than assume, When you know that one of them is of a higher grade, so you know that it's going to go ahead and produce more flour than the other one. Now, my understanding is, and as we will see soon, is that we're talking about that, again, don't forget, you're starting off that it was less than 100 to 1. And now we're saying that if you know that the chitin, that the chulin wheat is of a higher grade, it becomes permissible. It means now you're saying that I do have 100 to 1. How can you be sure of that? Just because one produced one increased over the other. I mean, does that mean? Did you know the exact amount that there was before? I mean, I guess maybe if you have 100 against one, you ground it and it changed. You know, one's going to produce more than the other. Then you automatically know that you are going to have more of the better grain, and therefore, but that also has to mean that this better grain produced, again, it was 100 to, it was less than, let's say it was 99 to 1. And now when you change it, you have to assume that the higher grain produced a whole more sa'ah. I don't know if that happens because you measure it afterwards. Is it something, maybe that's how you do it. You measure it afterwards and you see the increase. Can you still assume that the increase is exactly in such a way that it comes out that now you have 100 to 1, 100 the chulin more to the truma? I'm sorry if I'm being unclear. That's not clear to me how you know for sure. Again, the Mishna says if you know that the grain is of a better quality, then it's permissible. That means you have to be assuming that it produced more than the truma in a way that you have. If it was 99 to 1, that means you have to assume that it produced somehow or another. You have to assume that it produced enough to know it's 100 times more. So, however way you're going to know that, that's what the Mishnah is saying. That if it's known that the chulin wheat was higher grade than the truma, and therefore, and you're able to assume or know that now it's 100 times more because of that, then it's permissible. This goes so far as to say, the Radvan brings down that this goes far as to say that if, let's say, here, let me read this. Moreover, if a person has a mixture of grain in which the proportion of chulin to truma did not suffice to nullify the truma, but he knows that if he mills the mixture, the proportion of chulin to truma will increase sufficiently to nullify the truma, he is permitted to mill the grain in the first place with the intent to nullify the truma. I'm not sure exactly how he knows. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not being clear about this. Is it just, I guess you could, if you had 99 to 1, you ground it, and you measure now you have 101, you assume that the whole extra sa'ah, because it was a higher quality, came from the chulin. I'm not sure if that's an assumption. Maybe it's something you can tell. I'm not sure exactly. But what's interesting here is that the commentaries are saying that if you know that it will, meaning in our case, it says utachanan, and he ground it. Did he grind it on purpose? And not grind it on purpose. It's very possible to say he didn't grind it on purpose. And that's why now we have this new situation of 100 to 1 that can nullify. Can you intentionally go ahead and grind it so that because you know that you'll now have more chulin grain to be able to nullify the original amount that fell in? Are you allowed to intentionally grind it to create the situation to go ahead and nullify it? And the commentaries are saying, yes, you could. Now that leads us into a different question, that there is a rule that we know, as we've been mentioning until now, that's something called bittul nullification. By truma, that means if a measure of truma falls into 100 times of not truma, it can nullify it. In most cases, we say 60 times does more. We have cases where it can be the majority does that nullifies. There's a concept of nullification. But the rule is, as we're going to see very soon in the Mishnah, in the next part of the Mishnah, that to intentionally nullify something is forbidden to do. Midrabanan. Rabbis decreed it's not allowed to be done. If you do it, it doesn't work. That's what seems to be happening here. What seems to be happening here is, again, based on what I just said, you can intentionally grind it in order, because you know there's going to be more chulin flour to nullify it. Seems doing it intentionally. How can you do that? And the answer that's given is that when we say, or one answer that's given is that this rule of not intentionally nullifying truma means to do something that would normally have not been done for the purpose of nullifying it. Let's say we're talking about a case like ours. In our case, if you don't mix it, right? If you don't mix it, you're left with a suffix. If you don't grind it. We know there's 99 to 1, there's less than 100. It's a meduma. It's a mixture. We don't know what's truma, what's chulin. What do you do with it? You give it to the Kohen. What's the Kohen going to do with it? He's going to grind it. And when he grinds it, he's going to nullify it. So if being that grinding anyway is going to happen, and it's going to be nullified anyway, then there's no reason why I can't do that now. The rule of not intentionally nullifying doesn't apply then. It applies when you want to do something that normally wouldn't have been done, but something that's going to be done, like here, it's going to be ground anyway. So instead of the Kohen grinding it, I'm going to grind it. That doesn't fall into the prohibition, into the problem of not intentionally nullifying something. Now, before we go on to the last case, here the Mishnah specified if it's known that the chitim of chulin were of a higher grade than the truma, so you're going to produce more. You're now going to produce more chulin flour to nullify the truma flour, which is permissible. That wasn't mentioned in the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah just said you ground it; it became less. We say that it became less uniformly. Everything became less in the same way. The ratio stays the same. What about if you know that the truma is of a higher quality than the chulin, which would mean that the truma is going to produce more flour than the chulin? Would we say then usher, that's forbidden? Now the Mishnah doesn't say that. Based on what we just read in the Mishnah, in the case in the other direction, it should be that way. That if the same way in this part of the Mishnah, if you know that there is more chulin grain than truma grain, then we say mutter because now we have enough to nullify. And it should come out before that where we said that nothing changed when it was originally 100 to 1. We say nothing changed when you ground it. It should follow that if you knew that the truma grain was of a higher quality, then it would be able, that now we would not say permissible anymore. We should say that now we don't have 100 against 1. And according to many opinions, that holds true. It's the same. Even though the Mishnah didn't say it, but once the second part of the Mishnah qualifies and says that if you know that, basically the Mishnah says if you know one of them are higher quality, then you assume that it increased over the other one. The same thing would apply in the first case of the Mishnah. Okay. Sa'at truma shenafel l'pachas mimeya. A sa'av truma that fell into less than 100, not enough to nullify. V'achar kei naflu sham chulin. And then more chulin fell in. If it happened unintentionally, mutter, then it's permissible. Meaning, if you start off with 99 to 1, and then another sa'av chulin fell in, if it fell in unintentionally, then it can nullify it, and it will become permissible. And again, you have to remove a replacement sa'av for the Kohen, and then everything's fine. The mezid aser, but if you did it intentionally, meaning you threw in another sa'av chulin to nullify it, it does not become nullified. It remains forbidden. This is the case of not being allowed to nullify something intentionally, and that if you do, it doesn't work. That's the meaning here of this part of the Mishnah. If it fell in unintentionally, it can nullify. If it went in intentionally, it cannot nullify. Mitzvah kuf lamed daled. Mitzvah leisase shalachsa grushase mishnitzas la'acher. When he's not allowed to take back his wife who he divorced, his wife that he divorced, mishnitzas la'acher when she marries someone else. Shenamar, as the pasuk states, the first husband who sent her away, who divorced her, is not able to take her back after she has been defiled. Now, defiled just means, in this context, defiled means that by now marrying another man, she is now defiled to him, even though that other person divorced her. So if you go ahead and if a person divorces his wife and she remarries, we're not talking about a Kohen here, we're talking about a non-Kohen divorces his wife, he's allowed to take her back. But if she marries somebody else, then the Torah forbids it. And let's say the first one takes her back. He does kedushin with her. He's intimate with her. That is when you transgress this prohibition. By remarrying her and acting as husband and wife. And now that you have transgressed that, now we force him to divorce her. He's not allowed to stay married to her. Let's say she didn't actually fully get married to somebody else. And she didn't have chuppah, which means she wasn't intimate with her new husband. Just that kedushin was done on the other husband, just did kedushin on her, and then he divorced her. Nonetheless, that makes her forbidden she is still forbidden on the first husband. Let's say after he divorced her, she just acted immoral. She is not forbidden on her first husband to take her back. And also including this prohibition, a woman who committed adultery while married. She was intimate, she was married, she was intimate with another man. That shenesra al-baila, the halacha there is that once that happens, she's not permitted to stay. She cannot remain married to her husband. As it says, after she became defiled. Now, typically this word defiled means that she did something that really defiled her, and therefore included in this prohibition of the first husband not being able to take her back after she was defiled. In the basic context of the pasuk, it means because she married somebody else. It also includes a situation where a woman committed adultery, and because of that, she is now hutama. She now defiled herself. She committed adultery. He can't take her back. He's not allowed to be married to her anymore. But Reinitma, this woman who committed adultery, if the Torah says the first husband can't take her back for being defiled, well, committing znus, committing adultery, that's being defiled. But if, let's say, she didn't do it intentionally, she was raped. She's not the wife of a kayin. She does not become forbidden on her husband. It's only a willful act of adultery that forbids it on her husband. A non-willful act of intimacy doesn't make her forbidden on her husband unless he's a kohen. This applies in all places and at all times. Shavua Tov. Have a wonderful day.